Hello everyone, Palumbo here. Before we start this video, you're innocent until proven guilty. Video we're doing today, I've done something similar in the past, but we're going to go into more detail, folks. This is with regards to the group meeting Jez Wilkins. As far as we're led to believe, only two people supposedly met Jez Wilkins on Thursday night. That was Gerry McCann and Jane Tanner. Jez Wilkins states he's seen Gerry McCann, but he did not see Jane Tanner. But if you actually read the statement of Matthew Oldfield, he tells us that he seen Jez Wilkins during his checks. So when people say two people seen Jez Wilkins, Jane Tanner and Gerry McCann, I'm showing you that according to the statements, don't forget they're not my words, I'm just reading the statement. According to the statements, three people seen Jez Wilkins that night. Now this makes a difference, folks, doesn't it? This is Matthew Oldfield's rogatory statement. 4078, the detective asks Matthew Oldfield the following question. This is with regards to seeing different people during the day, who they spoke to, etc. But the question the detective asks Matthew Oldfield is, well, what about in the evenings then, when you were going back to check on Grace? Do you recall some of the other people around? This is the detective asking Matthew Oldfield that when you spoke to different people during the week and during the days, when you were going to do your checks of an evening, did you see any of those people around in the evenings, folks? Now, people can't take in these questions, so I'm going to read it again. The detective, Matthew, what about in the evenings when you're going back to check on Grace? Take that in, folks. He's not asking Matthew Oldfield, what about the days? He's asking Matthew Oldfield about his evening check. The checks specifically. It's a specific question to Matthew Oldfield. When you went to check on your daughter Grace, did you see any of those people around that you seen during the day, folks? So take that in. He's not asking Matthew Oldfield, did you see people during the days? He's asking Matthew Oldfield, did you see people in the evenings when you went to do the checks? Not when you went to the tapas restaurant. When you went to do your checks. Take that in because it's important. Matthew Oldfield replies, no, there'd been really anybody about, maybe an occasional one person. Was it the chap whose name I can't remember? He had a child who was willing to be part of or was being suggested for the interview. Jeremy Jeremy or somebody. The detective replies, yes, and Matthew replies, you had a child. Now take this bit in, folks, and associate it with the question being asked by the detective. When you went to do your checks in the evenings to check on your daughter Grace, did you see anyone around? Matthew replies, who had a child, and I think I'd seen him around because I think their child didn't sleep particularly well, and he may have been pushing or he might have been collecting from the creche, but what day or what time I don't really remember. So here you have an important question asked by the detective, and Matthew Oldfield tells him he'd seen Jeremy Wilkins during the evening during one of his checks, folks. But the detective cannot put two and two together. And say, well, when was that then, Matthew? Matthew tells the detective what day or what time that was, he cannot remember. But it be during one of his checks, because that's what he's asked by the detective. Matthew Oldfield checked supposedly at 9 o'clock, 9:30, and I presume every half an hour. So Matthew Oldfield would know what time he's seen Jeremy Wilkins. But the detective never pushes him. The detective cannot put two and two together, or the detective does not know about the case when doing this interview, to realize that only two people were supposed to have seen Jeremy Wilkins, and that was Jane Tanner and Gerry McCann. But here you have a third person who's seen Jeremy Wilkins in the evenings whilst doing their check, and that third person was Matthew Oldfield. So what does Matthew Oldfield tell us, folks? He tells us that this person, Jeremy, their child didn't sleep particularly well, and he may have been pushing or he might have been collecting from the creche. So this is what I'm saying about detectives. This is the way you work it out. As far as we know, there were only two occasions when Jeremy Wilkins collected his child from the creche or pushed his child in a pushchair, folks. One occasion was on the Wednesday night when he went to the tapas restaurant with his wife, Bridget O'Donnell. At a certain time during that meal, they received a phone call to say their child was crying in the creche. So Jeremy and Bridget went to the creche to collect their child, folks. That was on the Wednesday evening. But this was before Matthew Oldfield would have done any of his checks, folks. The Wednesday evening, Matthew Oldfield's wife, Rachel Manfili, states that she was not well on Wednesday, folks. So what does that mean? She did not go to the restaurant to dine in the restaurant, supposedly, Wednesday night. So what does this mean? It means that on Wednesday night, Matthew Oldfield would not have needed to go and check on his child on Wednesday night because his wife was already in the apartment with Matthew Oldfield's daughter. So he wouldn't have needed to do any checks on Wednesday night, the night Jeremy Wilkins collected his child from the creche. So you rule that one out. The only other night Jeremy Wilkins, as far as we know, pushed his child around in a pushchair was Thursday evening, folks. So you see, when Matthew Oldfield tells us that he's seen Jeremy Wilkins, excuse me, he thought that their child didn't sleep particularly well, and he may have been pushing, or he might have been collecting from the creche. When he tells the detective, but what day or what time, I don't really remember, then unless Jeremy Wilkins ventured to the tapas restaurant and he pushed his child around in pushchairs during the week, which we do not know of, as far as we know, he only did that on Thursday, then the only time Matthew Oldfield could have seen Jeremy Wilkins during his check, like I said, that's the question asked by the detective. During your checks, Matthew. So the only time Matthew Oldfield could have seen Jeremy Wilkins pushing his child in a pushchair would have been Thursday night, folks. Now, if that's the case, then it changes the timeline, doesn't it? Instead of two people supposedly seeing Jeremy Wilkins, i.e. Jane Tanner and Gerry McCann, you now have three people seeing Jeremy Wilkins, which means that three people were away, folks, in order to see Jeremy Wilkins. That was Gerry McCann, Jane Tanner, and Matthew Oldfield. Now you see what's wrong with the case of Madeleine McCann when detectives don't want to investigate such a thing, folks. It makes a difference. If you have a third person telling a detective that they seen Jeremy Wilkins and he was pushing his child in a pushchair and his child didn't sleep particularly well, the only time that we know he did that during the evening was on the Thursday evening, folks. So it means three people must have been away in order to see Jeremy Wilkins with a pushchair, folks, during their checks. Jane, Matt, and Gerry McCann. Now the chain of events should have gone as followed. Matt goes off, checks Madeleine's and his own daughter's shutter, as well as Russell O'Brien's and Jane Tanner's. Then he comes back. Then Gerry McCann went away. Then Jane went away. But if you have Matthew Oldfield telling the detective that he's seen Jeremy Wilkins during his checks in the evening, then it means 3 people were away, folks, at the same time, not 2. Makes you think.